Hi everyone, this is Elena. My presentation is on Elegy. It's a bit nerve-wracking to go first, so hopefully I didn't screw this up too much and ruin all of your lives. We're going to be talking about Jonathon Culler's essay, and this is just a picture of him because I think it's nice to put a face to the name. So, his essay, Lyric History and Genre, explores what makes a genre, which is kind of what we've been talking about in most of our readings. He goes back in time and explores historical definitions of genre, and then he moves it to modern day and talks about modern authors and critics and what they think of genre. He posits that genre can be theoretical or empirical, and I'm not going to define those because that's one of your questions at the end. But he says that writers write in relation to other texts and textual traditions, both consciously and unconsciously, imitating, misreading, and rejecting, and readers' approach works differently according to how they conceive them, even if those expectations are going to be disappointed. So this quote to me kind of points to the concept of mimesis, which is something that we've been talking about a lot in class 2. He basically says that writers imitate life, and then readers base their expectations of the story based on those imitations. Then he goes into lyrical mimesis a little bit more specifically. Here are some key quotes. Aristotle has little to say about it. Lyric was an important literary mode of his day, but perhaps because it is fundamentally non-mimetic, which is interesting because it's kind of in contrast to what he said earlier about mimesis. And then again, this is one of your questions at the end too. So think about what makes something non-mimetic. Lyric was finally made one of the 3 fundamental genres during the Romantic period, when a more vigorous conception of the individual subject made it possible to conceive of lyric as mimetic of the experience of the subject. The lyric poet absorbs into himself the external world and stamps it with inner consciousness. So I put this painting, Brugger's painting, The Fall of Icarus, because I think it's a good example of mimesis, and it's essentially imitating the myth of Icarus and Odysseus. And mimesis is a really common technique used in all forms of art, especially classical type of representations. Okay, apostrophic poetry was something that I thought was really interesting, and it basically means addressing inanimate objects, and that this is a common characteristic of lyrical poetry. Before we called it apostrophic poetry, we called it waxing poetical, which is a phrase that we still use today. He talks about William Blake's poem, and he says, addressed to the rose which personifies it as a sentient creature with a life of its own, creating an I-thou relation between poetic subject and natural object. So Blake personifies the rose, and in doing so creates this relationship between him and the rose, which is a common thing that's exemplified in lyric poetry, especially in Elegy. And then I got this definition just straight off of Google, just because I wanted to see what else we had to say about it. It says it's a figure of speech sometimes represented by an exclamation such as "oh." A writer or speaker using apostrophe speaks directly to someone who is not present or is dead, or speaks to an inanimate object. So I put this gif of Dead Poets Society up here because it's an example of an apostrophe that starts with the word "oh." And because it's addressing their teacher who is about to leave, so it kind of fits this someone who's not present as well. Okay, so let's talk about Elegy. Elegy is a poem lamenting the loss of someone or something. Loss and mourning are the common themes. And then a lot of elegies use personification to address inanimate objects and ideas. So I'm going to be looking at Mary Jo Bang's You Were, You Are elegy, and I'm just going to read it very quickly. Okay. Fragile like a child is fragile, destined not to be forever, destined to become other to mother. Here I am sitting on a chair, thinking about you, thinking about how it was to talk to you. How sometimes it was wonderful and sometimes it was awful. How drugs, when drugs were undid, the good almost entirely, but not entirely, because good could always be seen glimmering like lame glimmers in the windows of a shop called Beautiful Things Never Last Forever. I loved you. I love you. You were, and you are. Life is experience. It's all so simple. Experience is the chair we sit on, the sitting, the thinking of you where you are a blank to be filled in by missing. I loved you. I love you like I love all beautiful things. True beauty is truly seldom. You were, you are in May. May now is looking onto the June that is coming up. This is how I measure the year. Everything was my fault has been the theme of the song I've been singing. Even when you told me to be quiet, I haven't been quiet. I've been crying. I think you have forgiven me. You keep putting your hand on my shoulder when I'm crying. Thank you for that. And for the ineffable sense of continuance. You are the brightest thing in the shop window and the most beautiful seldom I ever saw. So this is, just, first of all, just a beautiful poem. I love it. I love these moments like beautiful things never last forever is the name of a shop, and everything was my fault is the name of the song. You can kind of see areas where the poet uses personification. So here she talks about good, glimmering. We talk about the chair, thinking, and then another way that we can classify this as lyrical poetry is because it talks about scenes of nature and beauty, something that Poe thought was really important to lyric. This poem also shows an I-thou relationship called you and me and hers. She's speaking directly to someone that she's lost, and she uses personal pronouns to kind of give the illusion of that conversation. She personifies objects, which I just kind of talked about or tried to. And then she talks about this idea of inner consciousness. It's more about like how she feels and how she remembers this person. And then I got this kind of idea of the 3 stages of loss from poets.org. It says the elements of a traditional elegy mirror 3 stages of loss. First, there is a lament where the speaker expresses grief and sorrow, then praise and admiration of the idealized dead, and finally consolation and solace. So if we look back at the poem, we can definitely see these 3 stages of loss. In the beginning, she's definitely lamenting, missing. She's talking about how things were awful, it's not destined to be forever, and then that she misses this person. And then she goes into phrases of praise and admiration. I love you like I love all beautiful things. You were, you are, beauty, things like that. And then towards the end, it seems as though the poet or the speaker kind of finds some consolation and solace because it says, you keep putting your hand on my shoulder when I'm crying. Thank you for that. So it kind of goes through these 3 stages all in one poem, which I think is really interesting. Okay. And then this idea of mimesis comes back as the elegy is mimetic of the experience of the subject. So since she's talking about this person that she's lost, and she kind of gives that person a voice to have their own opinions, this is what creates the mimetic kind of feature of the poem. And then I actually already talked about the inner consciousness. My bad. Okay, cool. So some questions that I have for you. I think that you don't have to answer all 3, but that might be something that Professor Hartsock can clarify for us. But my first question is, Culler identifies 2 theories of genre, empirical and theoretical. What distinguishes one from the other? Why are elegies considered lyrical? And then which of Sappho's lyrical fragments would you classify as an elegy and why? I just think this is an interesting question because her poetry exists as fragments, and elegy tends to have a bit more substance to it. But the emotion of elegy is definitely present in Sappho's writing. So which poem do you think exemplifies the most what it means to be an elegy? Okay. Thank you for listening and have a great day. Bye-bye.